So we spent the morning talking about what they are, the benefits, how you move towards them, and what I want to talk about is like how do you actually set up the policy so you have that direction. When we raised our hands, I always out myself as at my core I'm a policy person because I think that drives a lot of the decisions that we make. And I'm a really firm believer, as the director of the coalition, that having that complete streets policy not only sets that vision, but starts to lay the framework for moving from just talking about it or the policy into practice. Because really what you're trying to do, and this is another way that I talk about complete streets, is you're trying to transform all aspects of transportation into serving all users of all abilities. One of the things we talked a lot about this morning is the idea of a complete streets project. But does anyone have another definition of complete streets? That'd be somebody. Perfect.
I think from a permaculture perspective of like holistic thinking in terms of the environment, people, place, just everything.
Yeah, I think that's a great. So the answer was a kind of a permaculture, a holistic approach, and I love that because the way we actually talk about it first and foremost is it's at a process level. So it's actually my predecessor, who is now the Secretary of Transportation for Washington State. We swapped Washington's. He calls it changing the DNA of a DOT. But I think it even goes beyond the DOT. But it's so everything that you touch in regards to transportation, whether that's how you talk about it, whether it's your design standards, your policies, your procedures, you're really aligning so you're thinking about all users of all abilities every time you touch the system. It doesn't mean you always accommodate them. I think it's about building that networktivity, but that you're considering them. And that's really that that shift we made kind of post World War II, where we started to plan our transportation just for moving cars, not moving people. So this isn't like an anti-car thing, but it's about how do we move people. With this, so a complete streets policy is that first step in really embedding that new culture of that DNA within an agency, a city, and a community, so you ensure that the entire right-of-way is planned, designed, constructed, operated, and maintained to provide safe access for all users. So it really becomes what we call like the default decision. And I think about this this is like a slightly silly example, but like, when you walk into a grocery, so I guess a little back, like when I was in my 20s, like I could still get away with like eating Cheetos at midnight or going to happy hour every day. And I woke up in my early 30s and I was like, this is not working. This is not working. My pants are tight. Like, so I probably spent a year being like, I'm going to resolve that this is going to change. Like, I'm not going to eat chocolate this week, or maybe I'll go to, I'm going to go to the gym. But I didn't really want to change my lifestyle. I might do a thing here or a thing there, or eat something low fat, or go to spinning class once a week, but really nothing changed. And it felt like work. It felt awful. And then at some point I had another light bulb moment when I woke up probably with I'm a late night eater, and I woke up with like weapons in my bed and on my face. And I was like, so it's really gonna change. And it got into like, how do I actually redesign my lifestyle? So it's not like I'm occasionally gonna eat something low fat or go to the gym, but it's the first thing I do when I get up is drink a glass of water and move, whether that's walking or running or stretching. And and then it came into like things like when I go to the grocery store, I'm not going to straight ahead to the snack food aisle, but I'm going to go to those outer aisles where they put like the dairy and the produce and the fruit. And I kind of changed my DNA about how I operated. So then I don't actually think about all the time am I making the healthiest choice. It's just become embedded. And that's ultimately what you're doing with the Complete Streets policy and Complete Streets in your community. Again, you're just making it the default. So now I default to the produce aisle. You default to thinking about all users, and that might come in the form, and it doesn't mean that it just happens overnight. It happens through changing your checklist. It happens through changing your design standards. It changes how you do your needs statement on a project, how you fund projects, and it's hard work. I'm not going to lie, it's pretty hard work. We've been working with a few state DOTs over the last couple of years, and it's become it's a decades-long process. But they're already starting to see changes, and we'll talk about some of the work we did in Florida this afternoon. But it's also investment, so you create better streets opportunistically. This is one of the things that I think is really neat about Complete Streets is that you're not just building sort of these big corridors, but there are a lot of small ways that you can start to improve your street network to serve all users through and a policy helps support that. And an example of that is there's a community outside of Orlando. It's a suburb outside of Orlando. It's about 10,000 people, and they told me they didn't have a lot of money for construction. That's not what they're in, they just don't have the money. But they saw that their public works department, and they have a plan, this was their planning department, but their public works department was out there doing like stormwater projects, they were tearing up sidewalks to fix things. And they thought, well, gee, there's a lot of like smaller opportunities. I wish Public Works knew that. So they used their policy to go talk to the Department of Public Works, and Public Works was actually, they were like, yeah, we're open to it. So they have a monthly meeting where the Public Works runs its plan through them for the month, or not for the month, for the months ahead, and they work with planning to identify opportunities there where they can kind of make incremental changes. Like if you're doing a stormwater project, can you rebuild a better sidewalk there? If you're repaving, can you stripe in a bike lane? So it's within all of these, but it really took that policy direction for that to happen. So that each time you're touching it, not just in capital planning, you're making these small, low-cost, and quick projects that end up having high impact. That you're also, and because this is different in every region, but that you're ensuring that every project creates better streets now with your current funding sources. So you've all got, if you don't work in transportation, you've got like a list. It's usually called like your TIP, your Transportation Improvement Plan, or the list of things you're going to build. And are you ensuring that you are prioritizing projects that serve mobility needs of all users? So you're not just serving kind of one mode when you're programming out your TIP. And then saving money. I mean, retrofitting cost. I mentioned that retrofitting cost. This comes into some of the new development. So most new roads, at least in the communities that I have worked in, are driven by development. And to go back and retrofit those later is going to be a lot more expensive. So it's called like getting it right the first time. We're also learning through another program we run at Smart Growth America called Practical Solutions that when you actually start to build projects, this has been through some state DOT work, and look at trying to solve the problem before you come up with a solution, you actually end up building cheaper projects. And the example of that is, there was an interchange project in Washington State that they wanted to do an interchange project, like a large highway interchange, and that's what the engineers proposed, and they hadn't really thought out the needs statement, like what actually are we trying to do here? And when they actually thought about like what's the problem that we're trying to solve, and it was mobility, they actually ended up saving millions and millions of dollars because they didn't need that large interchange. But we go, and the engineers, planners, we go with the solution before we really talk about that problem. And then to give transportation professionals and all of you the political and community support for solutions. So when you are going, say if you're in the city and you're going to ADOT, your state DOT, or you're saying this is our policy, this is what we've decided as a city we want is to have complete streets. So this is where we want our funding to go. And I know funding works different in every state, but it starts to build your support so you can say to other regions, to other cities, to the state, this is what we have decided as a commitment. And then to start to address those systematic inequalities, which I'll get into more as I talk about policies. And so you're eventually building out that network, not just one corridor project, although I think having one good corridor to start is great, but eventually you're getting that complete network. I mentioned, but we now have 1,300 policies in the country. And when I came to take over the coalition 2 years ago, we had about 1,100. And you can find all of them. You can find a lot of great examples if you go to our website. So I've put it up there. We have this policy atlas. And I just like to share, these are represented in all different types of jurisdictions. We actually have the most of them in suburban communities, which is really interesting. And I like to show this because it shows it's not just a New York City, Washington, D.C. thing, but I think a lot of communities have shown this is the way they're starting to build support for better streets. We also see different types of policies. The most we see right now are resolutions, although we at the coalition are moving into, and I really encourage you as you think about adopting your policy, to not just resolve, so I'm not just gonna resolve to not eat chocolate or Cheetos in bed, but to actually make that just a binding ordinance. And I know that's something that I've talked to some of you about. So it's actually, it's a policy that has teeth. So the reason I'm going to divert a little before I talk about policies is, so I came in when the Complete Streets Coalition had 1,100-ish policies. So I talked to that steering committee, that slide I showed you, and we're like, we're good on policies. There's a lot of momentum. Doesn't mean we don't need a lot more policies, but we've been winning the policy battle. But how many of these are actually translating it into implementation? And so we spent about a year doing a lot of stakeholder interviews. Tim was part of these discussions. I'm going to keep calling him out about what is this, what do we really want to do moving forward? And we adopted a strategic plan that prioritized implementation, but also equity, because we're still winding up with a lot of unsafe streets, but unsafe streets in certain communities more so than others. And that what we wanted to do is how could we look at our theory of change and move these policies into practice and eventually projects that create these complete communities, which is exactly what we heard at the beginning. And how do the policies, how do we actually talk about, give new policy guidance, or how do we encourage communities to create even stronger policies to move through this theory of change? The work we pulled from implementation is, a lot of it came from work we did through state DOTs. I pulled up this particular report that we did for the state of Florida that actually the Florida DOT is using now to totally transform how they do transportation planning. They have a new multimodal design standards. They have a new way that they classify roadways. Some of you engineers probably know what I'm talking about. But we also, so this was the implementation angle. So we started to look at how can we set up policies that are going to move towards real implementation through our work in Florida. We did this work in Michigan and Vermont, and then I've done it in a lot of smaller communities. But also this idea, and Veronica brought this up earlier, and as did your mayor and vice mayor, of vulnerable populations. Like, how do you, as we're doing this and we're talking about safety, how do we prioritize the people that are least likely to be served by transportation choices, and at the same time might be most vulnerable to traffic fatalities? One of the ways we started was with a report that we call Dangerous by Design. We publish it every other year that looks at the most dangerous places to walk in the United States. Nationally, what we found is that while pedestrian fatalities went down, you can see this paralleled the Great Recession. As jobs went up, people started driving more. Again, pedestrian fatalities went up and reached kind of they reached like 2005 levels again in 2004, which was the last year the data was available when we did this report. But we wanted to dig further than just looking at total number of fatalities. And so what we did is we developed something called the Pedestrian Danger Index that really looks at your likelihood of being struck and killed as a pedestrian, regardless of, while controlling for factors such as population. So if I'm in New York, there's 6 million people. There are going to be more people, more pedestrians killed in New York City because there are more people. So that's the proportion of people killed. But are people more likely to be struck and killed in New York City, or are they more likely in another state? So that's why we developed this PDI. And what we use is we use something called Fatality Analysis Reporting Statistics. If you're curious, that's the FARS data, and walk to work data is a proxy for the amount of people walking. And this is what we found. So what this shows is the most dangerous places to walk in the United States are in purple, and the least dangerous places are in green. Anyone tell me what's in common with all those blue states?
Better climate for pedestrian walking.
Better climate. Any other ideas?
They're developed after World War II, at wider streets versus narrow towns.
Developed after World War II. Any other theories? Politics.
Immigrants.
Lot of land.
You probably get more immigrants from
More
other
immigrants.
countries along the border who tend to walk and use transit.
There really isn't a dense urban core in that whole stretch of purple, you know, like you would see a DC
Right,
or a
right,
New York
right.
City or a San Francisco.
Right. I think a lot of those things probably are true, and we didn't look at causation. I'll be really clear about that. So one observation, so these are all what, you know, this is the Sun Belt. They all are, I think, have all those characteristics, but one of the biggest ones is they were all built post-World War II, so they have a different type of transportation network than, say, if you're in Washington, D.C., in the urban core, if you're in New York City, and so they're built really to serve one mode in mind. Arizona's, if you can't see, it is number 6 here. Number 1 is Florida. 9. One of the reasons we worked with Florida is 9 of the 10 most dangerous cities to walk in the United States are in Florida. And it is not just older adults. Actually, the most dangerous place to walk if you're age 65 and plus is Hawaii. Florida's like 35 out of 50 states. So it's not older people. But we did look at age because we do have this aging population. This population that wants to age in place, they want to walk more, but they are, if you are 65 or older, you're 50% more likely to be killed. If you're 75 and older, your PDI, or likelihood of being killed, rises even more rapidly from being 65 and older. So it's over double. So you're likely, so it goes even beyond 50%. And I should say this, thank you ARP. I met one of the ARP representatives. Where did you go? ARP is actually the primary funder of this report because of the impact that pedestrian fatalities have on older adults. But we also looked at income, and we looked at the correlation, and this showed that as the average median income went up, the likelihood of being struck and killed went down. So poor neighborhoods, if you were in a poor neighborhood, you were more likely to be struck and killed. We looked at level of insurance, the relationship between the uninsured individuals and PDI. This kind of shows the same story. The less likely you were to have insurance, the less likely people living in an area where there were more people who were uninsured, I think I said that right, the more likely you were to be killed. And then we looked at race and really started to see further inequities here. This slide here, if you can't see it, and we'll make sure to share this with LSA, is that if you were not white, you were much more likely to be, you were overrepresented in pedestrian fatalities. This is another way to show it. So on the left here, if you were white, non-Hispanic, and so if you were Hispanic, African American, or Native American, you were overrepresented in pedestrian fatalities. We have not done a report on cycling, but there have been reports that have come out recently that have also looked at kind of inequities within cycling safety, so I wanted to pull some of those. So unfortunately, bike fatalities are on the rise in the United States. There was a report put out probably last month by the Highway Safety Association. Are any of you familiar with them? They also put out some pedestrian fatality reports. And this was the first time they did this. And they showed that there's actually been a 12.2 increase over the last 2 decades. We do have more people cycling, so that is probably part of that. But that, we had also 45,000 bicyclists were injured in 2015. But when you look further, so 23% of people of color, 13% of low-income households bike regularly. So we're seeing an increase in the number of people of color who are biking. I thought it was really interesting. Veronica was talking about earlier. Did you talk about this, or did we have a conversation about who's using dockless bikes?
We had that conversation earlier.
We had that conversation. This was but kind of who's using bikes is really interesting to watch, and who's using different types of bikes. The amount of people of color who are biking is going up more than white individuals, but they are still being struck and killed more. We did not, because this isn't our report, we didn't control like we did in Dangerous by Design, but it's just starting to show trends. You can look at some of this in Tucson as well. You have really good data. We actually have an interactive map on our website. You can go to smartgrowthamerica.org. And what I pulled up is the pedestrian fatalities in Tucson. We actually geocode them. But you can look at heat maps too, and you can start to see where these are happening. I don't know enough about this area to know there's a correlation between the neighborhoods that have the red spots, but you can look on this yourself. But I did, thanks to they left. Where did the there you are, you moved away, I'm too loud. They put together a bicycle and pedestrian safety report. And I encourage you to look at this, but it showed kind of the number of injuries in pedestrians and bicycles. And that there's, what did I do with the slide? I think it's not showing up, but you can start to look at this more too on a micro level. And I encourage you to, and you don't have to do this in a quantitative way, but compare maps of neighborhoods and where your pedestrian and bicycle fatalities are showing up. So this is a long way of me getting to kind of where we went with the strategic direction. So we knew that we needed to move into more implementation, and we wanted to address more vulnerable populations. So that our strategic direction really prioritized implementation and equity, and that we were going to do that in the process level and in the project level, but that we needed to first start by the way that we talked about Complete Streets policies. And this is actually the first time I'll presented on this. So you are all the first audience. So, and this is exciting. This is really exciting. Atherton and I have been talking about this for a while, is that this has always been the ideal elements of the Complete Streets policy. And what's really interesting is that the policies have been getting, not only have we been getting a lot more, but they've been getting better. But we have to really honestly look and say, are they changing things on the ground? And so as part of the strategic direction, we wanted to raise the bar and integrate our new strategic direction. So about 2 weeks ago, the steering committee adopted new ideal elements. And this shows what we did, but I'll talk about each one of these. And so as you consider and work towards adopting a Complete Streets policy, we're really hoping that you kind of take this new framework. I think there's an opportunity for Tucson to lead and adopt the first new Complete Streets policy. And so it's exciting. I'm really excited to talk about this. We were really pushing to get this adopted actually by this workshop. It was like pulling teeth just to get, not to have them vote for it, but to get a bunch of people that live all around the country on the same phone call to vote. It's like herding cats or herding bikes. I don't know what it is, but it was. So we've always had this vision, but what we're integrating this now into is intent. So Complete Streets vision, and this is something you really need to work out on your own. And I don't have, usually I have examples, but because of communities that have done a really good job, I'm not doing that this time because this is a new framework. So I'm hoping that if I do this in a year from now, I get to have Tucson in everyone. But this has always been about stating that vision, and you heard that from your vice mayor. What's changed about this on the intent is that we're giving a lot more kind of points, I should mention we grade policies every year. I think I neglected to say that. Has anyone ever read our Best Complete Streets Policies report? So we publish this report every year where we list all the best Complete Streets policies. Cities get pretty excited. The woman that manages it for my team kind of gets berated by emails every day about, where's my policy, what's my grade? It's been a great incentive to get people to adopt better policies, but one of the things we've never done is kind of give you more points or less points if it's binding or not. So that means, are you resolving or are you actually putting into code that you're going to do this? So we're giving a lot more points now for intent. And so if you have a binding ordinance, you're going to get a higher grade. We're also talking about this idea of networktivity. This used to be its own, but really, one of the misconceptions about Complete Streets is that it's just, it's a corridor by corridor thing that can end up being really expensive. And that we're saying that yes, you want to do those corridor projects, but it's also about making those process level changes within your agency. It's about creating more educational opportunities. It's about that permaculture, because you're trying to build this comprehensive network. So we built that into the vision. And then we talked about diverse users. So this used to be all ages of all abilities. But we've seen something I didn't show in this is that we're seeing that, one of the reasons that low-income communities and people of color are more likely to be struck and killed is they are living in communities with less pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. And so we're saying that, that we are giving more points for communities that really intend to benefit all users equitably, but particularly where vulnerable users and the most underinvested and underserved communities are. We are not saying who that is because it's going to look really different depending on your community. You might have a community that is all one race, but you're looking at pedestrian fatalities via income. It might have to do with ability. You might have a population that has a large population of people that have mobility challenges. And so, you might have, like we were talking about around Gallaudet University, I think you're going to have different changes, but that you are prioritizing whoever that is in your community who's most vulnerable. You all need to figure out who that is, because that's, I don't want to tell you that, but to go through that exercise, and that the best complete streets policies will specifically highlight communities of concern, and the policy will prioritize based on the jurisdiction's compositions and objectives. So we want, as you're going through this exercise of adopting a policy, thinking about, who that might be in your community and where you might need to start putting more infrastructure. Exceptions has been in there. We're just making this a little bit more clear. And exceptions are, so we've always had this thing built into a complete streets policy that we recognize that not every time you make a decision you're able to accommodate all users. Say you're doing a corridor project. So you should have an exceptions policy, but it should be clear and accountable, and there should be someone that has to make a decision about that. So we kept that in there, but we added to it somewhere. Now we're saying the exceptions process. So this is like, say, an engineer or a developer doesn't want to do treatment for pedestrians or bicyclists or people with mobility challenges. They not only have to provide written documentation, but it must also be transparent to the public. So they need to put out public notice. So what we've noticed is a lot of places that I have worked in that actually have really good complete streets policies. They're saying, well, why are we failing? Why aren't we achieving this? And I start to have conversations with them. And a lot of times it comes down to this, is that these exceptions, like developers in particular, will kind of continue to ask for exceptions, and they'll just be done in private, and no one will ever know this is going on. So this needs to be daylighted. It doesn't mean that it can't happen, but that there needs to be public notice if this is going on. And that these are the actual four kind of, which we have recognized kind of some of the most normal exceptions. This has been in there the whole time, but it's where accommodations is not necessary in corridors where specific users are prohibited. That might be a highway. It kind of depends on your state. The cost of accommodation is excessively disproportionate to the need or probable use, but I think this needs to be documented. And we've always said around 20%, but that really is project by project, a documented absence of current and future need. And so that's saying, well, no one's ever going to use that roadway. You have to be really careful with an idea we call latent demand. So just because no one's walking on a road doesn't mean they won't. But if the infrastructure doesn't support it, they're not going to. Someone say, well, we don't need to build a bike lane here, protect the bike lane. Nobody bikes on the street. Well, of course they don't bike on it. They're going to get killed. So it's looking at, it's like, so that can't be that. That can't be that. You really have to look a little bit further than that. And then emergency repairs that come up, but that temporary accommodations need to be made. This is one of my pet peeves in life, is that you will see often there'll be long-term construction, and construction is good. In an area that's growing, you want construction, then that's not a bad thing. But then if you're doing that and you're taking up part of the right-of-way, that you're building some type of temporary accommodation and then enforcing it. In DC, we have a policy that you need to do it. We don't do a very good job enforcing that. There's actually a street right by my office. It's called L Street, where I'll bike. I used to bike in an old office, and you're in this great protected bike lane, and then you get just thrown into traffic. Veronica, do you know where that is? It's at like 15th and L.
Yeah, right where the old Washington Post
Yes,
is.
yes. That is like, I send pictures to DDOT every day of that. Jurisdiction, so this is the next policy. This has always been in there, but we're encouraging, but what this means, so this recognizes that, that most of the time you don't always get that picture of what Veronica said. You have DC on one side and Maryland. It's really obvious. Most of the time you don't know, a user doesn't know when you're switching jurisdictions. when you're driving from one city to another, and that you really have to look at this as both a citywide thing, but a regional approach, but that you need to include, and private developers need to be held accountable to the same standard as the city. This is like a huge barrier to complete streets implementation, is that the city is doing a really good job, the community, and that there's such a fear of developers going away that we kind of let them get away with anything. And you know what, developers, like, they are used to negotiating and making deals. That is like what they're in the business of doing. But I think there's this fear that if we tell them no, they'll go away. And I think most of the time that isn't true. They will hem and they will haw, but they will, I think we need to put more accountability on developers. It was really interesting. I did some public meetings down in Charleston, South Carolina a few months ago, and the number one, we did all these surveys. It's part of a longer community engagement process on their new long-range transportation plan. And the number one thing in all the public meetings that the communities wanted was more accountability for the developers, that the developers needed to step up. So that is part of it. And that design, that you're really giving the tools to your engineers and your designers and your landscape architects, but I have my love for the engineers, like that they really have the best, they have the ability to use the best and latest design standards and guidelines. I don't know, I did that twice. Is that the same thing twice? And then here's yours. Where did our land use and content sensitivity go? I did this slide just for you.
Oh, I'm so appreciative, thank you.
But that you have to, and this is new, is that a complete streets policy must be sensitive to the community and its current and planned buildings, parks, and trails, as well as its current and expected transportation needs, but it needs to recognize that importance between land use and transportation. This is huge, and I think it's something we haven't talked about enough in the complete streets movement, is that we have to think about kind of what's going on, the budding land use to a roadway, if we're really working towards complete communities. I like the example that, was it Kelly that started out talking about Amazon? This whole Amazon thing is fascinating. Where's Amazon going to locate its second headquarters? We actually have an office pool. Kid you not, only Smart North America would have an office pool. But it's interesting to think about, I'm going to quote one of my colleagues who always says, cities in the country are in a fierce competition for a sense of place. And I think this is playing out really well with Amazon. And that you really can't afford not to, if you are going to thrive economically, invest not just in your transportation system, but in your communities. And land use is such a big part of that. You can't, I remember I was somewhere in Wisconsin on this big suburban arterial, and they were so excited to tell me that Regional Planning Commission that they wanted to put a bike lane on there. And it was like, oh, that sounds horrifying, because not only would it not be safe because the traffic, this was a really flat, wide, straight road, so not only would the traffic not slow down, but who would want a bike next to like seas of parking lots? That's not comfortable, and so we have to address the land use as well, and that's what people want. I think it gets into that is where people are wanting to move. That's where employers are wanting to go. We published this other report called Core Values, where we interviewed 500 CEOs to ask them why they're locating where they are, and it just confirmed what we've been thinking about, which is that employers are willing to pay a premium, or they're willing to relocate to downtowns and walkable, bikeable communities, because that's how they attract talent. And that is where, it's something is that you almost can't afford not to, and because that's where people want to go. And land use and context sensitivity plays a huge part in that. That you have to think beyond just that right of way. So that is a big new one. The best policies will say complete streets must be designed to serve the current and planned future land use, but that you need to have your land use policies and zoning ordinance support that. So that's in that policy work. Performance measures. Who was asking about performance measures? Someone asked about metrics. There we are. So performance measures is a huge part of it. I will get into more about performance measures, but you really need to, as you're working on your policy, right then establish your performance measures. Your performance measures, though, should be driven from the goals of your community. And this is where it gets in getting beyond level of service. Is that, you know, your vision should really inform what your performance metrics are. Because they should be things like accessibility, economy, environmental safety, and health. And that they should also, this falls into an interesting question we had about kind of displacement, is that we're also awarding points to performance measures that pay particular attention to how Complete Streets implementation impacts the communities of concern identified in the population. So it's starting to say we're willing to acknowledge there are some unintended consequences to investment, and we're going to measure what's going on there. If there are people being involuntarily displaced, and what's going on economically. A new element that we have is project selection. So and this applies a lot to the metropolitan planning organizations, but also cities, is that you're making your Christmas list of what you're going to build, that you are prioritizing projects that really give weight to active transportation infrastructure, targeting underserved communities, alleviating disparities in health, safety, and economic development, and prioritizing access destinations and creating better multimodal network connectivity for all users. So that what that's saying is, you know, I think about, you know, as you again, you've got that list of things you build. What is making it to the top of the list? There's and this just isn't like the pie in the sky. We actually took some of this, and you can ask me for the link, but the Virginia Department of Transportation is starting to do this through a program they called Smart Scale, where they're actually asking communities to submit, although Virginia owns the majority of the roadway network, the state, they're asking communities to submit projects, and then they're weighing them on these different measures. And what's really interesting is they're looking at the benefit cost of all of these. And what they're using is access destinations, creating better multi-networks, safety. These are the things they're now weighing their projects on. Unsurprisingly, Complete Streets projects are scoring some of the highest in the new Virginia Smart Scale tool. And so they are doing it at the state DOT level. And then the last thing that we have are the implementation steps. That you not just say what we're interested in, but how you are going to do it. And that is that you are going to restructure and revise your procedures, policy, and decision making, that you might look at adopting new design guidelines, that you're going to continue to offer training. I mean, this is a great first step, that you'll form an implementation committee, and that could be internal or external, and you'll create a community engagement plan as part of this. And I'm actually will spend the last part of the day going over each of the 5 of these. And so what you really have at the end of the day is you're going to have better policies, this is our hope, with better plans, better practices, better projects, and complete community.
Reviewing plans or working on a project that these policies would apply. But so we're talking about new construction under these conditions. But I keep seeing the word implementation on your slides, and I see pictures of a worst case scenario where it's an uncurbed section, and there's people trying to cross the street, and clearly that's an existing condition. So how do you marry implementation with existing conditions in a policy document?
Well, in the policy document, we actually say, like, the city of Tucson will consider all users of all abilities, and not just the planning, but in the maintenance, the retrofitting, the operations, the redesign, the retrofitting. So that would be the first step. And then I would say it gets into, in the implementation, when you are revising your procedures. So say, does Tucson have an asset management plan?
Yes.
So an asset management plan, tell me about your asset management plan.
Well, we have many pieces of it. We're in fact, we have to kick off next week in updating our software, our asset management software. We have cartograph license for updating what the new pieces, but
Could you speak up, please? It's hard to hear.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We're going to a new asset management plan right now. We have many pieces of the asset management plan. We have an ADA accessibility coming in here before the end of the year, that we've accessed every piece of sidewalk or lacking piece of sidewalk or buckled sidewalk or any of that here shortly. We'll have that in the next probably 60, 90 days, which is going to be an astronomical number of what it's going to take to put it back in place. We have a pavement management plan. We have separate pieces of assets that we're going to all roll into our cartograph system as a whole and get an idea of what, what do we have? What does it cost to get us to where we want to go on? Just generally, how do you replace the existing facilities?
Right.
Which is all it is. It's just an inventory, functional inventory of what you have and what is the condition of that. And so we have all these different databases. We're trying to incorporate them all into one place where we say, here's our allocation of funding for whatever that funding sources are. What can we do for that and what has the biggest bang for the buck at the end for that what if scenario is where we're going. We don't have it all put together yet, but we have several databases, several meaning 25 or 30 different separate distinct databases that have their own information in them. And we're combining those together into one place. As we perform maintenance activities and or capital projects, we put those in there and how do they all intertwine? And how do they achieve some of the things that we're talking about today? We do a lot of these in bits and pieces through checklists and design and things that we're doing and the public involvement. A lot of this is going on. It's just how do you put it in one place in order to function where you know you haven't missed it? And then what are the trade-offs? And the issue, the trade-offs are the hardest part of all this because we all want this. And so as we go forward, we don't have a striping plan and a marking inventory. We know what we have out there, we have inventory numbers, but I can't tell you how much 4-inch white line I have in this geographic area on a GIS later to feed them. That's where we want to go. We have a lot of that information, but there's several pieces that we do have. Pavement management, we have really good pavement management information. We're going to have really good ADA and accessibility information from a sidewalk and a path information. We have decent signal information down to the controller levels at each intersection. So we have lots of pieces, but we're rolling that in. We have a kickoff. I don't know, Carlos, where I see you. Where are you back there? When does that kickoff meeting?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. So it's happening now. So we're like right in the roll of this. And then I can look at when's our ADA coming in. I'm sorry, I'm picking on people since we're standing here.
October.
October,
Yeah.
Shelley?
I think for internal review, October.
So, and that number preliminary is just less than $1 billion worth of it, what that cost is. We have $650 million of asset of local road inventory that we need to pave roads. We have another $200 million in the large arterial streets, collectors and above, functional classification. So, we have all this data.
So
but we
it's
like
what
to
you
put
do
it in
with the data.
exactly, and
Right.
we like to have
And this
it in
is
one
where it's-
area in our pavement management, in our asset management system.
Right.
I mean to go out, but that's what we're going.
No, so
This all
that's great,
intertwined.
and it sounds like you're gonna have everything, so it's pretty much like if you own a house, like a to-do list, your maintenance, like you gotta redo your kitchen, you gotta redo the bathroom, you have to replace your windows. How do you decide what you do first? And I think the policies really say, will your policy address asset management? Will it address certain neighborhoods? I used to work, we had at Smart Growth America, the former chief of staff for the District Department of Transportation, and when she worked on redoing the city's asset management plan, they looked at kind of where current maintenance was going. And it was being concentrated in certain wards within the city of DC, and it happened to correlate with the higher income wards. And she asked the maintenance and operations department why, and they said, well, that's where we get the most phone calls. So within their operations maintenance plan, they looked at, in their asset management plan, they looked at, how do they change where they prioritize what they're maintaining based on, so it was more equitable throughout the city. So it wasn't just the wealthier wards, but you could also look at what types of maintenance are you going to do. Are you going to prioritize more multimodal maintenance first? Are you going to look at, so that's a way that you start to address through policy. I think that the policy could inform things like what you do with your current assets. Does that answer your question?
Well, what it doesn't acknowledge is, I think, as Mr. Cole demonstrated, we have a lot of maintenance
Yeah.
needs that many of them currently are unmet. So they're really, that money is pretty much earmarked. And while what you're saying is that you'd be able to, prioritize differently within all those needs, the shortcoming to that is that you can't address holistically the whole roadway environment. You know, it's the same thing as, you know, putting up a speed limit sign that may be different, but you're not changing the way the road feels, so it's not really having the effect that you want it to have. So you're only able to address that
Yeah,
one
and then part of it is you have to, I mean, we're fixing decades of failing infrastructure, and I think it's failing us in a lot of different ways. The way that the ASCE looks at it is it's actually just, it's not gonna work anymore. We have bridges, our bridges are failing, but it's also failing people. And, you know, our ability to get around in different modes based on different abilities, and that you do have to prioritize. Like, you know, just like in my own budget, I don't have, gosh, I wish I had infinite money, but I don't, and we all do, but as you start to build out and make those incremental changes, that you're prioritizing things that are gonna serve more, you know, multimodal users, or certain communities, or certain types of users. And that's really a policy decision that then TDOT will take. And that's what they do with all that data. So they're gonna have all that data, but then it's like, well, what do we have to do? And that's where the policy comes in. Another question?
Well, as an engineer and a manager that's been involved in change management, I know that professionals can do the technical part of the job competently, but people tend to do work the same way they're used to. I'm assuming that's one of the roles of the community engagement plan, is to sort of make sure it's continues on this path of equitable treatment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part community engagement. It's part that you know, it is having a plan that you work off of that involves a lot of training. Like the FDOT example that I showed, they didn't just take the plan and then were able to roll with it. They're currently, every district is doing training. We've gone back and done a lot of training. I mean, they have invested millions of dollars in training the DOT to then implement that, because it isn't something that, you know, regardless of whether you're 5 years in or 50 years into your career, you're just able to, you know, it's like, well, go do something differently. Well, it's like, well, you have to give people the tools to do it differently. And I think providing that ongoing training is part of it. But the community engagement part is important because you're also building the support to give training to, you know, to your DOT. I mean, I think as we saw the Great Recession, I was at a county government when the Great Recession happened, and all our professional development went away. You know, so we weren't able to learn how to do new things, and so it's prioritizing that as well. But the community, you know, asking for that is huge. Any other? Oh, we got 1, 2. So we got one back there. And could you speak up, because I heard in the back it's harder to hear.
I'm Mariana Joseph from the city of Tucson. Back in 2013, we put together Plan Tucson, which is the city's general and sustainability plan, which went through an extensive outreach effort. It was approved by voters per state law. And we talked plenty already about complete streets. When you read through the different policies throughout the document, complete streets, interconnectivity, all this stuff that we're talking about is already reflected there. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel at this point, but I am interested about the next steps, right? How do we actually go into prioritization? How do we go into implementation? I think that would be very valuable for this workshop at this point. We had talked about, you know, the need for the city of Tucson to have its very own comprehensive multimodal transportation plan that is not just looking at the mayor's arterials like, you know, the PIM Association of Government does, you know, but look at all the different levels of service, you know, different performance measures, et cetera, et cetera. So I would like to better understand what tools, you know, we can actually take advantage of to move forward. And what funding mechanisms, not just to implement projects, but to actually engage into, you know, putting together these tools. That's all I have to say.
That's great. We do have that as the last section of today. But if we don't get to it all, I will continue to talk to you, and I'll share with LSA all our implementation resources. And one other question?
It was more of a comment, going back a couple of questions about implementation, because I think obviously money is a big thing, but I think the benefit of having a policy is not everything is about money. It's a big thing, but not everything. There's sometimes there's things we're gonna do anyway, and we just need to be making better, more conscious decisions. You know, for whatever reason, maintaining our roads and resurfacing, well, let's not put the same thing that was there before. Are there areas we can improve with for the same money? Things like that we need to be thinking about.
That's a, yes,
No, you aren't. No,
it's
you
like
aren't.
I planted you.